Good morning. My name is Kyle Kroger and I'm on staff at Fellowship Church. We're going through the book of Ezra this semester, which some of you may have forgotten since our last teaching in the series was 5 weeks ago. But it's actually really fitting that we took a break when we did, because there is a 58-year gap in between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. It was, of course, written at the same time, but as the events of the book unfold, there are almost 6 decades in between the completion of the temple that Rollin covered 5 weeks ago in Ezra 6 and what I'm covering today in Ezra 7. In fact, the entire book of Esther takes place in between these 2 chapters. That's a big deal. Most of the people listed in chapters 1 through 6 are dead. The story of the temple being rebuilt has concluded, and a new story is beginning. It's still part of the bigger story of Israel starting over, but it is in a new context with new characters. So before we dive into chapter 7, we're going to look at a timeline to get some kind of context for where we are in history. And I realize that some of this is going to sound a lot like some of the stuff that Ray and Stephen and Mark and Rollin have already shared. But it's not. It looks a little bit different, so keep listening. 149 years before Ezra chapter 7, King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonian Empire begins conquering the nation of Israel and deporting the Hebrew people to Babylon. This takes about 20 years before Israel is completely conquered, ending with the fall of Jerusalem. Towards the beginning of that conquest, Daniel, y'all know what I'm talking about? Daniel, he's from the book of Daniel. Okay, so Daniel is deported as a boy and becomes one of the most powerful royal advisors in Babylon for 62 years. Then in 539 BC, during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, King Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon, which you would think would be the end of Daniel, but actually he becomes extremely influential in Persia and is believed to be a huge reason why King Cyrus sent the Jews home. You see, it's at this point, the first year of Cyrus, that Ezra chapter 1 begins. This is where Ray picked up 11 weeks ago. 49,000 Israelites give up everything they know and go back to the promised land under the leadership of Zerubbabel. It's exciting. And then 9 weeks ago, Stephen covers chapter 3, where the Israelites got to rebuild the altar and give sacrifices to God for the very first time at the temple site, for the very first time in 50 years. And everything is going great, and the temple's going to be rebuilt, just like God has been promising. And then 8 weeks ago, Mark teaches and ruins everything. He explains that a lot of people opposed the project. The neighboring people didn't want to see the temple be rebuilt. And they were able to convince King Cyrus' son to stop the project. Rollin then covers chapter 5 and 6, where some of the Jews resume work on the temple, which causes some political strife, but in the end, God moves through the heart of King Darius and not only enable, but empower the rebuilding of the temple. And they finish. In 515 BC, the temple is rebuilt, which Rollin explains that this concludes an epic 400-year story. But as I mentioned earlier, this is not where we pick up. 29 years after the temple is rebuilt, Darius I dies and Xerxes comes into power. And if you've read the book of Esther, Xerxes ends up with a Jewish queen, Queen Esther, who uncovers a plot to kill all the Jews in Persia, and she foils it. This is where our stories collide. Even though the book of Esther ends 17 years before Ezra chapter 7, and there's already a new Persian king in power, this is important because at the time that Esther was using her political influence to save the Jewish people, Ezra was a 6-year-old Jewish boy living in Persia. Not only did she save his life, but early in Ezra's childhood, a Jew influences the king of Persia to advocate for her people. First Daniel before his lifetime, then Esther during his lifetime. This is the historical context of Ezra chapter 7, because Ezra chapter 7 is about Ezra. It's the first time he shows up on the scene. The first part of Ezra is a history from a scholar. It is an account from a learned Jew in exile. The second part is the memoir of a priest. It is the journal of a holy man. It is the autobiography of a godly hero. Lord, I ask that you would, just let me pray. Amen. Ezra 7, verses 1 through 5. After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, son of Zadok, son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, son of Meraiah, son of Zerahiah, son of Uzai, son of Bukai, son of Abishua, son of Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the chief priest.
This Ezra came up from Babylon. Y'all see what he just did there? I don't think y'all see it, so I'm going to read it again.
After these things, during the reign of George W. Bush, President of the United States, Ezra, the son of Billy Graham, the son of C.S. Lewis, the son of John Wesley, the son of Martin Luther, the son of Gregory the Great, the son of St. Augustine, the son of Polycarp, the son of Timothy, the son of the Apostle Paul, one of the first missionaries. This Ezra came up from Babylon. Now, the people in Ezra's list are actually related to each other. But this was never meant to be a true genealogy. Some of these people in this list are grandfathers or even great-great-great-great-grandfathers. Others were uncles. But all of them were famous priests. Sariah, who was likely Ezra's great-grandfather, was the last high priest to serve in Solomon's temple. When King Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, he killed Sariah and then destroyed the temple. Hilkiah was the high priest during the reign of Josiah, who found the book of Deuteronomy and helped Josiah lead a nationwide spiritual reformation. Zadok was the priest that saved King David's life and later helped King Solomon gain the throne. Phinehas was a famous warrior priest. And of course, Aaron, who is the brother of Moses, was the first high priest. Many of these other names aren't as famous to us, but they were famous to the audience that Ezra was writing to. Ezra isn't listing a boring family tree. He is making a statement. He is making a claim. Now, based on his actions later on, we don't think he is saying, I am the rightful heir to become the high priest. Some think he was, they might be right, but what is clear is that he was saying, I had the family line to be a spiritual leader in Israel. Family line was a big deal back then. He was saying, I have the credentials to become your priest. This Ezra came up from Babylon. Now, he continues, Ezra was a teacher well-versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. I'm going to skip down to verse 10 real quick. For Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord, and to teaching its decrees and the laws of Israel. Here's the second part of his credentials. Not only does he have the family line, but he has the education necessary to perform the task. Ezra's building up these massive credentials, this amazing family line, this education, and it kind of makes you wonder, okay, Ezra, what's your plan here? What do you need these credentials for? And then in verse 6, at the end of verse 6, he makes it even more intriguing. He says, the king had granted Ezra everything he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was on him. Whoa. Amazing credentials, and now the king of Persia is involved. This story just keeps getting better and better and more impressive, and we still don't even know what's going on. All we know is that Ezra, who has amazing credentials, asked the king of Persia for something, and he got everything he asked for. Then verses 7 through 9 give us a glimpse of what he asked for, but then they don't really answer the question. He says some of the Israelites, including priests, Levites, musicians, gatekeepers, and temple servants, also came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month of the 7th year of the king. He had begun his journey from Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month, and he arrived in Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month, for the gracious hand of his God was on him. Some of you just zoned out. Come back to me. We're not even going to cover these verses this week. They fit better with Ezra chapter 8, so I'm going to talk about those next week. Verse 10 expands more on his credentials. I already read that. Then in verse 11, we realize that Ezra is never going to directly answer the questions that we want him to answer. What do you need these credentials for? What did you ask the king? How did you ask him? How did you even get the connections to ask him? Ezra never answers those questions directly. Instead, he gives us a copy of the letter he received from the king, which gives us a lot of clues. We'll never know exactly what Ezra asked for or how he asked, but this letter gives us several answers indirectly. Now, since it's a letter, I wanted to read it all the way through, but I didn't want you to get tired of my voice, so I'm going to have Connor from my home group read through the king's letter, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to look at it in sections. There's the letter, and there's a lot in there, so let's break it down. In verses 11 through 12, or 11 and 12, we notice that this is a personal letter to Ezra. The king didn't write this letter to a governor to inform Ezra of these things. The letter is to him. In verses 13 and 14, the king and his 7 advisors commission Ezra to inquire about Judah and Jerusalem with regard to the law of Ezra's God. This is where some of the puzzle pieces start fitting together. Even though the temple had been rebuilt for almost 6 decades, people weren't obeying God. In fact, they didn't even know how to obey God because they didn't know the laws of God. This is why Ezra needed these credentials. He requested permission to go to Jerusalem so that he could teach the Hebrew people how to obey God. And verse 10 suggests that he had been working towards this goal pretty much his whole life. I mean, he wasn't that old. Most scholars would agree that he was probably around 23 years old. This was his calling in life, to teach the Hebrew people how to obey God. And the king grants him what he asked for. That's got to feel good. God has chosen to use him in his life's calling. That's awesome. But then it gets even better. In verse 15, the king says, "Here, take this giant amount of money of my personal wealth that I'm giving not to Ezra, but to the God of Israel, so that you can pay for all the sacrifices. Not only am I allowing you to complete your life vision, but here, let me pay for it." That's awesome. Then verses 16 through 19 flesh out some of the details. They also show that Artaxerxes had some kind of understanding of the sacrificial process. But then it gets even better. In verse 20 through 22, he says, "And if what I'm giving you isn't enough, I am issuing a decree so that you have access to the royal treasury." And he gives some kind of limits, but to give you guys some perspective, 100 talents of silver is 7,500 pounds of silver. 100 cores of wheat is 36,000 pounds. 600 gallons of wine, 600 gallons of olive oil, and salt without limit. All of these things were used as currency back then. These are ridiculous limits, far more than they could have even carried. But then it gets even better. In verse 24, he basically says, everyone that goes with you is exempt from taxes and exempt from work. I'm not sure what kind of government duties they had back then, but that might be like us being exempt from taxes and jury duty. And then it gets even better. In fact, it becomes pretty unbelievable. Verses 25 and 26 make Artaxerxes sound crazy. I'm going to read it. He says, "And you, Ezra, in accordance with the wisdom of your God, which you possess, appoint magistrates and judges to administer justice to all the people of the Trans-Euphrates. All who know the laws of your God, and you are to teach any who do not know them. Whoever does not obey the law of your God and the law of the king must surely be punished by death, banishment, confiscation of property, or imprisonment." Artaxerxes is putting Ezra in charge of Western Persia, with the authority to kill people, take their stuff, kick them out of the country, or put them in prison. This is Persia. Goes all the way from Egypt way into Asia. This is the Trans-Euphrates, literally translated beyond the river. Artaxerxes tells Ezra that he is in charge of making sure everyone in Egypt, Palestine, and Turkey are obeying the laws of the God of Israel. And if they don't, he can kill them or do pretty much whatever else he wants to do with them, as long as the laws of God tell him to do that. That is some crazy. I looked at commentary after commentary to find a different interpretation because that just didn't make sense. What the heck does he see in Ezra that he would give him that kind of authority? This is a crazy letter. First, he gives God his personal wealth. Then he gives Ezra access to the royal treasury. Then he makes the entire group tax exempt. And then he gives Ezra carte blanche authority to make sure the laws of God are being obeyed in almost 1/4 of the Persian Empire. People don't just do that. This seems like a bigger deal than Cyrus giving Zerubbabel a bunch of money to go rebuild the temple to have another God on his team. So as I was studying this passage, I started looking for motives. What are his motives? Why did he do this? And as I studied and studied and studied some more, I developed 3 theories, which I was very proud of, by the way. And then God came in and gave me one truth. I narrowed it down to 3 possibilities, and then God gave me one actuality. Theory number 1, Artaxerxes is just an over-the-top kind of guy. In verse 23, Artaxerxes says, "Whatever the God of heaven has prescribed, let it be done with diligence for the temple of the God of heaven. Why should his wrath fall on the realm of the king and his sons?" This is the only motivation that Artaxerxes expresses in his letter, and it's very similar to Cyrus's motivation. He's the king of this giant empire, and he wants to have as many gods on his side as possible. Theory number 1 says that maybe Artaxerxes is just an extreme guy. He goes to extreme measures in seeking the approval of neighboring gods, which is a decent theory, but it wasn't my favorite because it doesn't make sense why he would put Ezra in charge of other nations that worshipped other gods. Theory number 2, what if Artaxerxes was Esther's son? I had this thought and then I was like, surely I'm not the first person in 2,500 years to think of this. So I started researching it, and at first it was looking pretty good. Xerxes was killed by his firstborn son, and his second, Artaxerxes, took the throne. And I know this is kind of stretched, but I thought Esther was his second queen, second son, and then history pooped on my parade. First, in order for him to be Esther's son, he couldn't have been older than 13 or 14 when he gained the throne 7 years before he wrote this letter, which has happened before, but it's usually recorded. Second, and more importantly, if it were true, there is no way on the earth as we know it that the Hebrew nation would not have recorded it at least 1,000 times. They were master historians, especially when it came to the bloodline of Abraham. As a stepmom, Esther may have had some kind of influence, but he wasn't her son. Theory number 3. 2 years before this letter, a man named Anaris, supported by Athenians, started a revolt in Egypt. I'm going to spare you the details, but this was the biggest problem in Persia at the time of this letter. And it was far away from any of the Persian capitals. So it's theorized that Artaxerxes was trying to use Ezra and the laws of God to help keep order or suppress disorder in his kingdom, which is a great theory, and I was finding a lot of support for it, but then God gave me his answer. He, of course, did it in a much more eloquent way, and he used a lot less English. But he showed me that I was missing the point. When Ezra writes in verse 6, the king had granted him everything he asked, for the hand of the Lord his God was on him. My immediate reaction was, awesome. How was the hand of the Lord your God on you? How did God do it? And some of you may have similar reactions. That reaction isn't bad. That's why I went ahead and put the 3 theories in this teaching. That reaction can be very worshipful. I wanted to know how God brilliantly made this happen. I was excited to figure out how God did what he did. And that, of course, isn't bad, but God showed me that by getting wrapped up in that, I was missing a crucial element to Ezra's story. Even if one or more of these theories are correct, Ezra almost certainly didn't know about them when he was making his request to the king. It is obvious in verses 27 and 28 that Ezra is blown away by what God did through his act of obedience. This is his response to the letter. Praise be to the Lord, the God of our ancestors, who has put it on the king's heart to bring honor to the house of the Lord in Jerusalem in this way, and who has extended his good favor to me before the king and his advisors and all the king's powerful officials. Because the hand of the Lord my God was on me, I took up courage, and I gathered leaders from Israel to go up with me. We're going to be talking about Ezra's actual journey next week, and I hope you come because in chapter 8, Ezra does something absolutely insane, and I can't wait to tell you about it. But this week is about Ezra's step of faith that makes the journey possible. Guys, there are 2 types of obedience in our faith: obeying the laws of God and obeying the voice of God. Sometimes those are very interconnected, but here's what I mean. The laws of God, don't covet, don't hate, don't lust, etc., are common to all of us. We look at the Bible and we say, yeah, that's pretty clear. That makes sense. There's some gray areas in there, and we talk through those, but the voice of God is often not that clear. Sometimes it's a whisper, other times we have an idea, and later we're like, oh, I think that was from the Lord. On top of all that, even in the times that it is relatively clear, you are the only one that hears the voice of God in your life, which is scary. If you come to me and say, hey, I was thinking about not murdering my teacher, I'd be like, good. That's a good direction. Let's go with that. I can confirm that for you. But if you come to me and say, hey, I think I need to break up with my girlfriend, or hey, I think I'm being called into ministry and I want to switch my major and my parents aren't happy about it, that is not as easy. And I'd be able to give you some advice, maybe share some stories with you, but in the end, it would be between you and God to make the right decision. And that decision would affect the rest of your life. Obeying the laws of God often define your physical, spiritual, and emotional health. Obeying the voice of God often defines who you are. It may be hard for us to picture this, but at one point there was a pre-success Ezra. There was an Ezra before the king sent this letter. And that Ezra looked a lot like you guys. He was probably 23 years old. He had done a lot of schooling and had maybe a few years of work experience, but he probably looked a lot like you guys. And then he gets this idea. We don't know how he got it, whether the Lord just straight up told him or he got this idea and then later realized that it was from the Lord. But he has this crazy idea to make a giant request of the king of Persia. It was not uncommon back then to be killed for offending the king of Persia. What Ezra did was a big deal. It's easy to miss that. I started getting so caught up in how God made it work out for Ezra in the end that I missed the gravity of the situation at the time Ezra was obedient. At some point, and probably soon for many of you, God is going to ask you to do something that will change the course of your life forever. It may not include becoming famous one day like it did for Ezra. It may not have one defining moment like it did for Ezra. Instead, it may be several requests over time as God gently shapes where he wants you to go. But I am convinced that God has an epic story available to every person in this room. And your involvement in that story is contingent on your obedience to the voice of God. Ezra obeyed the voice of God, and God did something amazing through him. Next week, we're going to find out that Ezra continues to obey the voice of God, and God does even more amazing things through him. Crazy things, things that movies are made out of. By listening to the voice of God, God makes Ezra an epic hero. If you are starting over, one of the first things you need to do is start listening for the voice of God. He often talks to us through the laws of God, but you have to start looking for it. You have to start listening for it. And once you hear the voice of God, obey it. It may seem really hard. In fact, there are times it seems impossible to obey it. But God always makes it worth it. If God has put something on your heart to go do something or go be someone, and the Bible supports it, and you've run it by your closest community and let them push back on it or refine it with you, then go do it or go be it. Lord, I pray that you would make heroes out of the people in this room. Will you help us become obedient even when it is really scary or when the science just doesn't add up? We don't want to limit you from doing amazing things in our lives. Will you please bless us as we strive to serve and obey you? In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.